Two men walk into the same clinic on the same morning. Both are 64. Both weigh 78 kilos. Both wear the same size jacket. If you lined them up side by side, you would not be able to tell them apart. Their blood results come back. One man's testosterone reads 542. The other reads 353. Same age, same weight, same waistband. And a hormonal gap that looks like 20 years of aging had happened to one of them and not the other. For most of the last 40 years, medicine would have shrugged at this. Same weight, same risk. That was the assumption. And so the second man would have been told what millions of men his age are told. It's just your age. It happens to everybody. Try to relax more. In July of this year, a study published in the Journal of the Endocrine Society explained exactly why those two men were different. And the answer had nothing to do with what the scale said. It had to do with where the fat was sitting. Stay with me, because by the end of this you will understand something about your own body that most men your age will never be told, and you will know the one measurement that matters more than the number on your bathroom scale. Let's start with the tool that has been quietly failing you. Body mass index. Your weight divided by your height squared. It was invented in the 1830s by a Belgian astronomer named Adolphe Quetelet, who was not trying to measure health at all. He was trying to describe the average man, statistically. He never intended it as a medical instrument. Nearly 200 years later, we are still using it, and it has one enormous blind spot. BMI cannot tell muscle from fat, and it has no idea where the fat is. That second part is the one that matters, because fat is not one substance. It is not evenly spread, and it is not equally dangerous. The fat you can pinch between your fingers, under the skin, on your arms, your thighs, your lower back, that is subcutaneous fat. It is, metabolically speaking, relatively quiet. It stores energy. It sits there. But behind your abdominal wall, packed in around your liver, your pancreas, your intestines, there is a completely different tissue. That is visceral fat. And it is not a storage cupboard. It is an active organ. It manufactures hormones. It releases inflammatory signals directly into the vein that feeds your liver. It has its own chemistry. Two men with identical BMIs can carry wildly different amounts of it. The researchers behind the new study make this point with a beautiful example. Think about professional sumo wrestlers, and think about international rugby forwards. Enormous men, waistlines that would alarm any doctor looking at a chart. But when you actually scan them during hard training, their abdominal mass is dominated by muscle and by subcutaneous fat. The visceral component is often surprisingly modest. Now flip it around. There is a body type researchers have nicknamed thin outside, fat inside. A man who looks lean in a shirt, normal BMI. Nobody would call him overweight. And yet, on a scan, the space around his organs is packed. Same number on the chart, two completely different bodies. So for decades, we have been sorting men into risk categories using a 200-year-old statistical shortcut that cannot see the thing that actually matters. Which brings us to what happened when somebody finally looked properly. The study was published in July 2026 in the Journal of the Endocrine Society by Carl Friedel and Adam Potter at the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine. They took data from the American National Health Survey, a large, carefully weighted sample designed to represent the whole population, 4,948 men. Of those, 4,492 had something rare and valuable, an actual body scan measuring the area of visceral fat in square centimeters, not an estimate, not a tape measure, a measurement. And every one of them had a morning testosterone reading taken by mass spectrometry, which is the most precise method available. Here is what they did that was clever. Instead of simply asking, do heavier men have less testosterone, which we already knew, they held weight constant. They took men within the same BMI category and then split them by how much visceral fat they actually carried. Lowest quarter against highest quarter. Same weight class, different insides. Now the numbers. Among men in the normal weight range, BMI in the healthy zone, the men nobody worries about, those in the highest visceral fat quarter had testosterone around 353. Those in the lowest quarter, same weight range, sat around 542. That is the gap I described at the beginning, and it is not an outlier. Across every single weight category, normal weight, overweight, and obese, men with high visceral fat had roughly a third less testosterone than men of the same weight with low visceral fat. When they repeated the analysis using waist circumference instead of BMI, the gap ranged from 25 to 39%. And then comes the line that should stop you where you stand. Read that again slowly. A slim man with fat around his organs was hormonally worse off than a heavy man without it. One more finding, and this one matters for anyone tempted to think they're safely under the line. When the researchers plotted the relationship across the entire range, they found no threshold, no cliff edge, no safe zone below which visceral fat stopped mattering. Testosterone declined steadily and continuously as visceral fat rose, from the very lowest levels upward. There is no, a little belly is fine. There is only a slope. Now I want to do something most channels will not do, because it costs them their headline. That study only included men aged 20 to 59. The researchers chose that range deliberately. They wanted to strip out the age-related decline of the testicles themselves so they could isolate the effect of fat. Scientifically, that was the right call. But it means that if you are 68 or 74, you are not in that sample. And anybody who tells you the findings transfer to you automatically is guessing. So let's go and get the evidence that does apply to you. And by good fortune, the best data on the planet for men your age is European. The European Male Aging Study, 8 countries, thousands of community-dwelling men aged 40 and above followed properly. The landmark analysis was published by Frederick Wu and colleagues in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2008. What did it find? It found that disruptions of the hormonal axis in older men were differentially linked to age and to modifiable risk factors. In plain language, yes, some of the decline is the calendar, but a substantial share of it is not the calendar at all. It is body composition, metabolic health, and other things that can still be moved. But here is the point that gets lost. For most men over 60, the age-related component and the fat-related component are stacked on top of each other. One of those two layers is fixed, the other one is not. And for 40 years, men have been told the whole thing was fixed. So how does fat around your organs reach up and change what your testicles produce? There are 4 routes, and they run at the same time. The first is an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase converts testosterone into estradiol, the primary female sex hormone, which men also need in small amounts. Fat tissue is where much of this happens. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2025 found that roughly 80% of the estradiol in a man's body comes from this conversion happening in tissues outside the testes, and that aromatase activity in fat tissue is measurably higher in men with obesity, rising in step with body fat percentage and waist-to-hip ratio. Worse, the estradiol then travels to your brain and signals that hormone levels are adequate, so your brain sends fewer instructions to your testes to produce more. You lose on both ends. The first is an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase converts testosterone into estradiol, the primary female sex hormone, which men also need in small amounts. Fat tissue is where much of this happens. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism in 2025 found that roughly 80% of the estradiol in a man's body comes from this conversion happening in tissues outside the testes, and that aromatase activity in fat tissue is measurably higher in men with obesity, rising in step with body fat percentage and waist-to-hip ratio. More visceral fat means more conversion. Your body is taking testosterone you have already made and turning it into something else. Worse, the estradiol then travels to your brain and signals that hormone levels are adequate, so your brain sends fewer instructions to your testes to produce more. You lose on both ends. The second wire is insulin, and a protein called SEGBG. Visceral fat drives insulin resistance. Your cells stop responding properly, so your pancreas compensates by producing more and more insulin. And chronically high insulin suppresses the liver's production of sex hormone-binding globulin, which is the protein that carries testosterone through your bloodstream. There is also direct evidence, from work published in 2005 in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism that as insulin resistance increases, the Leydig cells in the testes, the actual factories, secrete less testosterone. Not indirectly, directly. The third wire is inflammation. Visceral fat is not passive tissue. It continuously releases inflammatory signaling molecules. Those signals interfere with the communication line running from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland to the testes. Research published in 2015 found that men with obesity and low testosterone showed exactly this combination: insulin resistance, inflammation, and elevated aromatase activity all at once. Think of it as static on a telephone line. The message from the brain still gets sent. It just arrives degraded. The fourth wire is the newest and the most interesting. Fat tissue produces a hormone called leptin. In a healthy system, leptin tells your brain you have enough stored energy. But when fat mass stays high for years, the brain becomes resistant to the signal, the way it becomes resistant to insulin. A review published in 2023 describes what happens next. Elevated leptin and high circulating insulin reduce the expression of receptors for a neuropeptide called kisspeptin. And kisspeptin is the master switch that controls the release of the hormones that instruct your testes. That is the deepest level of the problem. Not a factory fault, a fault in head office. 4 mechanisms, running simultaneously. Every day, quietly, for years. This next part is rarely explained to patients, and it may be the single most useful thing in this video. When you get tested, most laboratories report total testosterone. That is everything in your blood, the hormone that is bound to carrier proteins, plus the small free fraction that your tissues can actually use. But we just established that visceral fat lowers SHPG, the main carrier protein, and here is the consequence. When the carrier protein drops, total testosterone drops with it, even if the usable free portion has fallen by less. The new study measured this directly. When the researchers added SHPG into their statistical model, the amount of variation in testosterone they could explain jumped from 18% to 45%. SHPG was doing an enormous amount of the work. This cuts in 2 directions, and both matter to you. First, it means total testosterone alone can overstate how bad the situation is in a man carrying a lot of visceral fat, which is a reason not to panic at a single number. Second, and this is the important one, it means the number on your printout is describing your metabolic health at least as much as it is describing your testes. Low testosterone, alongside low SHPG, is not really a testicular story. It is a liver, insulin, and abdominal fat story wearing a testicular costume. And notice what the researchers found even after accounting for all of that. Visceral fat remained independently associated with lower testosterone. SHPG explained a great deal. It did not explain everything. If you take one practical thing from this chapter, take this. If you ever have your levels checked, it is reasonable to ask whether SHPG can be measured alongside total testosterone. Those 2 numbers together tell a story that either number alone cannot. That is a conversation to have with your own doctor, who knows your history, but it is a conversation worth knowing exists. Now, the part that explains why this creeps up on men so slowly they never notice the moment it began. It runs in both directions. Visceral fat lowers testosterone. We have spent 13 minutes on how. But low testosterone also promotes the accumulation of visceral fat. Older intervention studies showed that when testosterone is restored in deficient men, visceral fat falls preferentially, often without a dramatic change in total body weight. A review in Obesity Reviews in 2019 gave this its proper name, a vicious cycle. Low testosterone drives fat accumulation, and fat accumulation drives testosterone lower. Picture it as a wheel turning slowly. Each year, a little more fat around the organs, a little less hormone, which makes it slightly easier to add fat next year, and slightly harder to hold muscle. And because it turns so slowly, a few centimeters a decade, there is never a day when you notice. There is no alarm. There is just a man at 64, wondering why the same effort produces less than it used to, and being told it's simply his age. But here is the thing about a wheel. A wheel that turns one way can be turned the other way. This is the part that most videos on this subject get either dishonest or vague. I am going to give you the real numbers, including the inconvenient one. What the evidence shows. A meta-analysis published in the European Journal of Endocrinology in 2013 pooled 24 studies and found that weight loss significantly raised testosterone and that the degree of weight loss was the single best predictor of how much it rose. A larger analysis published in the journal Andrology in 2023 pooled 44 studies covering more than 1,700 men. Dietary weight loss raised total testosterone by roughly 2.5 nanomoles per liter. More substantial interventions raised it considerably more. Now the inconvenient number.
Research indicates that the meaningful reactivation of the hormonal axis, the signal from the brain genuinely coming back up, not just a small shift in the blood, typically requires a reduction of around 15% of body weight.
15%. For a man of 90 kilos, that is roughly 13 kilos. I am telling you that because I would rather you hear a hard number from me than an easy promise from someone selling something. But, and this is genuinely important, the visceral compartment does not behave like the rest of your body. It is metabolically active, which is precisely why it is dangerous, and also precisely why it responds first. Visceral fat is typically among the earliest fat to mobilize when habits change, which means the hormonal benefit tends to start arriving before the mirror shows much of anything. So here are 4 levers, and none of them cost money. Lever 1. Buy a tape measure and stop trusting the scale. You now know BMI cannot see what matters. Waist circumference is imperfect too, but it is far closer to the truth, and it costs almost nothing. Measure at the level of your navel, standing, after breathing out normally. Same time of day, same conditions. Once a fortnight. For context, the large European Tromsø study, which followed more than 1,500 men, found that men with a waist of 102 centimeters or above had significantly lower testosterone and SPAG than men below 94 centimeters. Those two figures are widely used clinical reference points. The trend line over months matters more than any single reading. Lever 2. Defend your muscle. After 60, muscle is not vanity. It is a metabolic organ, and it is where a very large share of the sugar in your bloodstream goes. Lose muscle, and glucose has fewer places to go. Insulin rises, and we are back at wire number 2. This means resistance work, anything that loads the muscle. Bands, body weight, a couple of dumbbells, machines at a local center. 2 or 3 sessions a week is the general recommendation for older adults, and it means eating enough protein to actually build with, a decent, palm-sized portion at each meal rather than everything at dinner. If you have any cardiac condition, joint replacements, a hernia, or you are on blood pressure or diabetes medication, this is a conversation to have with your doctor before you start rather than after. Ask them how to begin, not whether to. Lever 3. Protect your sleep, seriously. This one is badly underrated and the evidence is startling. Rachel LaProult and Eve Van Cotter at the University of Chicago put healthy young men in a laboratory and restricted them to 5 hours of sleep a night for 1 week. Published in JAMA in 2011, the result was a 10 to 15% drop in daytime testosterone. For comparison, the authors noted that normal aging reduces testosterone by roughly 1 to 2% per year. 1 week of short sleep did what a decade of aging does. And short sleep also promotes abdominal fat accumulation. So this feeds directly back into the loop. If you are over 60 and sleeping poorly, and especially if anyone has ever told you that you snore heavily or seem to stop breathing at night, that is worth raising with your doctor. Untreated sleep-disordered breathing is common in men your age. It is treatable, and it sits right at the center of everything discussed today. Lever 4. Walk after you eat. The simplest of all. A 10 to 15-minute walk after your largest meal reduces the post-meal glucose surge because working muscle pulls sugar out of the blood without needing much insulin to do it. Lower insulin peaks, over months and years, mean less pressure on every mechanism in Chapter 4. It requires no equipment, no membership, and no permission. I want to close by being precise about the limits, because you have given me 20 minutes and you deserve honesty rather than certainty I don't have. First, this is correlation, not proof of cause. The central study was cross-sectional, a snapshot of thousands of men at one moment, not a trial that followed them over time. The authors say so explicitly, and they note that the relationship almost certainly runs in both directions. The title of this video is a strong statement. The evidence behind it is strong, biologically coherent, and consistent across many studies. But it is not the same thing as proof, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Second, this is not an argument for hormone replacement. Nothing here says you should seek testosterone therapy. That is a serious medical decision. With real risks and real benefits, it requires proper diagnosis, and it belongs entirely between you and a qualified doctor who has examined you. What the evidence in this video actually points toward is the opposite direction. That in many men, the low reading is a symptom of a metabolic situation, and that addressing the situation is more fundamental than replacing the hormone. Third, nothing here is a substitute for your own doctor. I am describing published research. I am not describing you. I do not know your history, your medications, or your heart. If anything in this video concerned you, the right next step is a conversation with your physician, not a purchase. I want to leave you with why this matters. And it is not about the number. Testosterone in a man over 60 is not fundamentally about vanity or about youth. It is bound up with bone density, with whether a fall at 78 becomes a bad week or the end of independent living. It is bound up with muscle mass and with whether you can still carry your own shopping at 80. It is bound up with mood, with energy, with the simple daily willingness to leave the house. That is what is actually at stake, not a figure on a printout. Autonomy. And what the research of the last 2 years suggests is that a meaningful share of what men your age have been told to simply accept, the fatigue, the softening, the slow retreat, may not be a sentence handed down by the calendar. Some of it is, but some of it is sitting quietly behind your abdominal wall, and it is not entirely deaf to what you do next. You cannot get younger. Nobody can sell you that. But you may have more room to move than anyone ever told you. Measure your waist this week, then go and have a proper conversation with your doctor, armed, for once, with the right question.